Late one night in 1998, during a violent storm in Edinburgh, a homeless man pushed his way through Greyfriars Kirkyard in search for shelter. Rain hammered against the gravestones as he moved between them, wind tearing through the iron gates and ancient trees. At the far edge of the cemetery stood a domed stone mausoleum. The lock on its iron gate had been weakened with age. After a brief struggle, he forced it open and stepped inside. The interior was dry, shielded from the storm. Several coffins lined the walls. Whether it was curiosity or simply something to occupy his mind in the darkness, he began to tamper with one of them. That was when the stone floor beneath his feet suddenly gave way. He dropped into complete darkness. And what he fell into was not soil, and it was not an empty space. Beneath the mausoleum lay a sealed vault, a lower chamber that had remained closed off for centuries. It was packed with human remains, almost like a hidden mass burial beneath the tomb itself. Because the space had been enclosed for so long, the bodies had not fully broken down as exposed graves normally would. Bones and flesh shifted under his weight. The air was stale and heavy. Disoriented and terrified, he scrambled upward, clawing through what lay beneath him until he managed to drag himself back into the mausoleum. Moments later, he fled the kirkyard, vanishing into the stormy night. That tomb that he had broken into belonged to Sir George Mackenzie, remembered in Scottish history as Bluidy Mackenzie. And long before that storm in 1998, the ground beneath Greyfriars had already been used for something far darker than burial. Long before Greyfriars Kirkyard became known for ghost stories, it stood in the middle of a country divided by religion. In the 17th century, King Charles II restored bishops to the Church of Scotland and insisted that worship follow a structure approved only by the Crown. Many Presbyterians refused to accept that authority. They believed that they answered to Christ alone and not to a monarch, and they became known as the Covenanters. At first, the resistance was quiet. Ministers would preach outdoors, on fields and hillsides, holding illegal gatherings known as conventicles. But as those meetings grew in size, the government responded more aggressively. Soldiers were sent to disperse them, arrests became common, fines were imposed. The tension between the Crown and the Covenant hardened year by year. In the spring of 1679, the conflict escalated sharply. After an assassination of a senior church official aligned with the Crown, armed Covenanters clashed with government troops at Drumclog and unexpectedly defeated them. The victory was brief, but forced the monarchy to respond decisively. King Charles would send his son north with a large army, and on the 22nd of June 1679, the two forces met on Bothwell Bridge, and once government troops secured the narrow crossing of the bridge, the rebel position collapsed. Many fled, and over 1,000 men were captured that day. Those prisoners were marched to Edinburgh and confined inside a walled enclosure within Greyfriars Kirkyard. It was not a structured prison, but an open space beneath the sky. There were no barracks and no shelter from the weather. The men were held there for months, exposed to the rain and cold, given only minimal rations of bread and water. Illness spread quickly among the prisoners, forced to sleep on bare ground. Conditions were harsh and unforgiving. Some prisoners weakened from hunger and disease within weeks. Others attempted escape. Those who were caught were executed as warnings to the rest. Beyond the kirkyard walls, the legal process continued. Covenanters were brought before the courts, charged with treason, and in some cases condemned to death. These executions were carried out publicly in Edinburgh, and the severed heads of certain condemned men were displayed on city gates on pikes as a deterrent to others who might resist the crown. Historical records confirm that dozens died during the months of confinement, and hundreds were later transported overseas. But later accounts and oral tradition paint an even darker picture. According to some Covenanter narratives passed down through generations, the dead were not always treated with dignity. It is said that bodies were removed without ceremony, and that for a while the enclosure became a place where the dying lay beside the dead beneath the open sky. Whether every detail of those later accounts is precise is difficult to determine. What is clear is that the imprisonment left a lasting scar in Scottish memory. The imprisonment at Greyfriars did not happen by accident. Behind the arrest, the trials, and the sentences stood the Crown's chief legal officer in Scotland, Sir George Mackenzie of Rosaha. Born in 1636, Mackenzie was educated, ambitious, and fiercely loyal to the Stuart monarchy. By 1677, he had risen to the position of Lord Advocate, effectively the King's chief prosecutor in Scotland. His job was not to fight battles, but to enforce the law. And in a time of religious rebellion, that meant pursuing Covenanters charged with treason. After the defeat at Bothwell Bridge in 1679, the Crown's legal retaliation was placed firmly in Mackenzie's hands. As Lord Advocate, he directed the persecutions of the captured Covenanters. But Mackenzie's reputation had already begun forming earlier in his career. In the 1660s, he had taken part in prosecuting alleged witches during the period when witchcraft accusations still carried the death penalty. Though he later wrote critically about the reliability of certain accusations, he nonetheless operated within and defended a legal system that allowed torture and execution under specific conditions. To royalists, Mackenzie was a defender of order. To his critics, he became something far darker. It was during the years of the Covenanter persecution, a period later remembered as the killing time, that his nickname took hold. Bluidy Mackenzie. Whether he earned that title through cruelty, severity, or simply his association with harsh sentences remains debated. Some historians describe him as a hardline legalist, enforcing the law of his era. Others argue he showed little sympathy for dissenters, and wielded his authority without hesitation, and even enjoyed it. What is undeniable is that his name became synonymous with repression in Scottish memory. When Mackenzie died in 1691, he was buried in Greyfriars Kirkyard, the same ground connected to the prisoners whose persecutions he had overseen. A domed mausoleum was built for him, one of the most imposing tombs in the cemetery, and later was named the Black Mausoleum. For nearly 3 centuries after Mackenzie's burial, Greyfriars remained a place of history rather than haunting. There are no reliable records of violent paranormal reports connected specifically to the Black Mausoleum prior to the late 20th century. The cemetery was old and atmospheric, and deeply layered with memory, but not widely regarded as dangerous or paranormal. That changed in the end of the 1990s. Following the disturbance of Mackenzie's tomb by the homeless man in 1998, accounts began to circulate among visitors and tour guides. At first, they were subtle. People described sudden cold patches in otherwise still air. Some people claimed to feel the sensation of being touched lightly on the shoulder or back while standing inside the Covenanters' prison. Then, the nature of the reports shifted. Visitors began leaving with scratches on their skin. Red, thin lines across their arms, their faces, and their necks. And in some cases, guides claimed welts appeared while they were watching, forming on skin that had not been touched by anything visible. Others reported bruising, and a number of visitors claimed to have fainted either within the prison enclosure or shortly after exiting it. As stories spread, so did the numbers. By the early 2000s, tour operators were claiming hundreds of recorded incidents, often citing figures between 350 and 450 physical attacks, allegedly linked to the area around the Black Mausoleum and the Covenanters prison. These claims included scratches, burns, broken fingers, and feelings of strangulation. There were even reports of individuals requiring psychiatric treatment after encounters they believed followed them home. Official documentation of these cases is limited, and skeptics argue that expectation and suggestion in such an environment can produce powerful physical reactions, like the placebo effect. The name began appearing in newspapers and paranormal publications. The Mackenzie Poltergeist. In 2004, further damage to the mausoleum intensified attention. 2 teenagers broke into the tomb and disturbed human remains inside. They were later prosecuted under historic grave desecration laws. The incident reignited media attention and reinforced the narrative that the mausoleum was not merely historical. Stories continued to emerge. One account describes a man who climbed the wall beside the iron gate of the Covenanters prison late one evening. From the top, he reported seeing a tall, dark figure standing motionless below, pressed against the bars. And when the figure moved out of sight, it did so without sound. Seconds later, the space beneath him was empty. Another long-standing story concerns a schoolboy from near George Harriet's school who allegedly hid inside Mackenzie's mausoleum to avoid punishment. According to a local lore, he was discovered in a state of hysteria and never spoke publicly about what had frightened him. The details are difficult to verify, but the story persists. Greyfriars had by this point acquired a new identity. It was no longer just a historic burial ground. It was being described as one of the most violent poltergeist sites in Britain. And in November 1999, one man decided to confront whatever was said to be there. His name was Colin Grant. In November 1999, a 66-year-old minister and self-proclaimed psychic named Colin Grant entered Greyfriars Kirkyard after dark. By that point, reports of scratches, fainting spells, and physical attacks around the Black Mausoleum had been circulating for months, and the local media had begun taking interest. According to contemporary accounts, Grant had been asked to intervene and attempt some form of spiritual cleansing. He agreed, and a journalist and a photographer accompanied him to document what would unfold. The three would enter the gates and walked deeper into the cemetery, past the gravestones and toward the domed Black Mausoleum. Witnesses later said that as Grant approached the tomb, he appeared visibly unsettled. He slowed. He hesitated. Those present described a palpable tension in the air. Rather than enter the mausoleum itself, Grant altered his plan. He moved instead toward the open enclosure of the Covenanters prison, the same ground where prisoners had once been confined under Sir George Bluidy Mackenzie. It was there, he believed, that the unrest may have begun. He began to pray, at first quietly, then more forcefully, reading aloud from scripture and invoking protection. Accounts from that night state that he paced the enclosure for hours, speaking into the darkness, at times turning toward the mausoleum as though addressing something within it. Some versions of that story claim he attempted not to confront Mackenzie directly, but to free the spirits of the Covenanters who had suffered there. As the ritual intensified, Grant reportedly arranged candles in a rough circle around himself. Witnesses later claimed the flames flickered erratically, despite relatively calm conditions. Those present described the atmosphere as charged. Grant continued directing passages of scripture toward the mausoleum. His voice, according to reports, grew strained. The ritual stretched late into the night. Then, as the evening reached its end, he faltered. Accounts differ on the precise sequence, but those present stated that Grant suddenly appeared overwhelmed. He staggered, and then he collapsed. In the moments surrounding the incident, he is reported to have said the words to the effect of, "This is going to kill me." He recovered enough strength to leave the kirkyard that night, and only 2 months later, in January 2000, Colin Grant died of a heart attack. The official cause of death was natural, but for skeptics, the sequence was a coincidence. An elderly man exerting himself on a cold November night, later succumbing to underlying health issues. For others, the timing felt less comfortable. And there was one detail from that night that refused to be ignored. During the ritual, as Grant stood within the candlelight facing the church, the photographer accompanying him captured several images. In one of them, taken moments before his collapse, a dark shape appears in the church window behind him. The church was believed to be locked and empty at the time, and no definitive explanation has ever been agreed upon. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed today's video, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing. It really helps the channel, and until next time, peace.